Welcome back and thanks for joining us. This PowerPoint presentation and the accompanying narration was created for East Texas Baptist University for course Criminal Justice 3316 Critical Incident Management, and I'm Dr. Eric Hillman. Chapter 5 is entitled Strategic Planning, a Systems Approach. Chapter 5 has been divided into several segments to make it easier to upload and easier for you to view. This is Chapter 5C. Before you start viewing this chapter, you should have already viewed and taken notes on Chapter 5A and Chapter 5B. When we talk about strategic planning, there's always a section on lessons learned. Resiliency can be defined as the capacity to recover from difficulties. This tree has a lot of resiliency. There's been some erosion of the system, the dirt for the root system, and yet still it hangs on and it's still alive. Perhaps not in a healthy position, but it has a lot of resiliency. This tree has recovered from a lot of difficulties. If you're an incident commander and you're thinking in the strategic sphere, the big picture, you need to build resiliency into your plans. You also need to encourage your personnel to think likewise, and your equipment planning needs to have resiliency in it. We've got to learn from past mistakes. Now that seems very simple, but there are many leaders who do not encourage learning from past mistakes because when they try to find out where mistakes are made, they do it with the purpose of deciding who to punish. And so a good strategic planner will actually encourage his subordinates to identify what went wrong and why, and how it can be done better in the future. So if you have a subordinate who's willing to identify a mistake, a shortcoming, and suggest a way it can be done better in the future, that subordinate should be rewarded and not punished. Everything can be improved in some way, and so we should constantly be thinking of ways to improve all our systems with strategic planning. So we're going to look at several riots that have taken place in the history of the United States. We're going to look at some where the police response was effective and some where the police response was not effective. Why? Because we need to learn from our mistakes and learn from our successes. One of the first riots we'll look at was the 1980 McDuffie riots in Miami. McDuffie is a neighborhood in Miami. As with many inner-city riots, this started with a police shooting. In this case, police shot a black man, and there was those in the community who felt like that shooting was not justified. This resulted in 3 days of rioting in Miami in 1980. As a result of that rioting, 18 people were killed and there were 180 serious injuries, as well as countless number less serious injuries. Over $100 million in property damage. $100 million is a lot of money, and that's 1980 dollars. That would be significantly higher in 2020 dollars. That's 40 years ago. During these riots, the police were understaffed. They had not been well trained in riot control, and they had not been issued sufficient equipment for riot control. The police response then was to set perimeters, in other words, to surround the area that was rioting, and then just have a hands-off approach. Just let everything burn down inside that area, inside the perimeter. What this meant was black neighborhoods were burned down and there was a permanent loss of 3,000 jobs in black neighborhoods in Miami. So certainly not all black people rioting, and what the police non-response led to a significant economic recession and depression in the black neighborhood, something it could ill afford. Because of the police response, they were criticized for being non-assertive. Miami-Dade. Miami is the city and Dade is the county. Police response for people analyzing the McDuffie riots was considered really a complete failure. Because the police couldn't handle it, the National Guard were finally called in, and they finally brought the rioting under control. So what could the police have done better? Other police departments facing riots, facing protests, looked at and analyzed the McDuffie riots in Miami to determine what went wrong. Everyone considered it a failure, but even if it is a failure, you should still study it and learn from it so you don't repeat the same mistakes that the Miami police made in 1980. Moving forward to 1999, the World Trade Organization had a conference in Seattle. Seattle police worked hard. They were well equipped with riot gear, but they were still caught by surprise. The problem was, in 1999 in Seattle, this was the first time that a large and well-organized group of rioters planned and executed a coordinated attack to disrupt an international economic conference. So these are rioters protesting against the economics of the United States in relation to other countries, and they were extremely well coordinated. The McDuffie riots were spontaneous, based on anger and not planned out. The problem with the McDuffie riots in 1980 in Miami is that the police response was insufficient. Here the police are well equipped, but the protesters are also well equipped and well organized, something that the police did not expect. What is an anarchist? An anarchist is a person who believes in no government control whatsoever. Unfortunately, anarchy always leads to violence because in the absence of any kind of government force, it's just survival of the fittest and gangs roam the street. The anarchists, the anti-government protesters, were very well trained and very professional in their tactics, almost to the level of having military training. The anarchists were very coordinated, and what they would do is they would, in groups, have hit-and-run actions against the police, and they used walkie-talkies. This is 1999, of course, so walkie-talkie, now people would use cell phones, but they used walkie-talkies and cell phones. What would they do? They would attack the police by coming out of the crowd, and of course your anarchists are not wearing uniforms like in a traditional war, so you don't really know who the good guys and the bad guys are in the crowd. But they come out of the crowd, attack the police, and then blend back in with the crowd. They would organize these attacks with cell phones, and they would monitor and flank police operations. So they actually had anarchists strategically placed in windows, in upper story windows in buildings with cell phones and walkie-talkies, and they would communicate with the group exactly where the police were. For instance, they could say, on 2nd Avenue by Nordstrom's, there are 30 police officers. However, 1 block over, there's only 5 police officers. Let's attack where there's only 5. And by flanking police operations, that means they would not only attack head-on, but they would attack from the rear at the same time and cause a lot of confusion in how the police should respond. Then, when police finally did respond in big enough numbers to that location, they would simply blend back into the crowd, take off their masks, and it was hard to tell who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. 2003. Now we're back in Miami. So this is the third protest or riot that we've seen. This one is the FTAA, Free Trade Area of the Americas Conference. Since we're back in Miami, you would expect that Miami police would have learned from the McDuffie riots, and in fact they did learn from their past mistakes. So this is the same Miami-Dade Police Department. However, 23 years have gone by. These commanders have studied the failures of the 1980 McDuffie riots, and they've learned from their past mistakes. Instead of simply sitting back and letting the rioting areas burn, they used what they called early intervention strategies. They also created something called the Mobile Field Force, or MFF concept, that worked so successfully in Miami that most other police departments adopted mobile field forces after 2003. They also made sure they had sufficient forces to deploy quickly where needed. So they were understaffed in 1980, now they have enough forces. They were under-equipped in 1980, now they have riot gear. They had a laid-back, just let what happens happens attitude in 1980, now they're adopting early intervention strategies. Instead of simply being on the defensive, they decided to go on the offense. Instead of merely trying to establish straight lines, they realized that mobility was a key to handling these protests. And instead of just sitting back and allowing protesters to do whatever they were going to do, the Miami-Dade Police Department invested a lot more in intelligence, in their own undercover officers, in their own operatives, perhaps some even working with protesters, so that they could report on and know what the protesters were doing. That's the importance of intelligence. And they also acted proactively rather than reactively. When they saw the issue building, they would strike early and strike hard. They simply wouldn't sit and wait for it to happen, and they wouldn't just surround the problem and not intervene. They would strike early and strike hard into the violent protesters. They were well trained and well disciplined with rules of engagement. When you're well trained and well disciplined, you don't respond in anger to someone talking bad about your mama. But as soon as someone lays hands on you, then you know that you are able to arrest that person for assaulting a police officer. So you've got to have very strict discipline to make sure none of your officers loses their temper and reacts inappropriately or even illegally. One of the things that was developed in the late 1990s and early 2000s was the use of bicycles to maneuver quickly and outflank protesters. So if you're on foot, you can't move quickly. But if you're in cars, police cars cannot get through crowds quickly. And so bicycles were found to have a very good use in protests. So normally you think of bicycle patrol as officer friendly on the bike path in the suburban neighborhood, but these bicycles were used to get officers around quickly, and they could also be used as barriers between officers and protesters. Fire department was allowed to use water cannons in certain situations. This would allow the city to drive back protesters without inflicting serious injury. Cut teams were used. What do I mean by cut teams? Remember the protesters we talked about in earlier chapters, the yellow protesters? When we said yellow, we said they were non-compliant but also non-violent, and many times they would chain themselves together into chains that would take forever for the police to clear. So in this conference, the police had cut teams already assembled of police officers who had the proper tools to cut chains, to cut PVC piping, etc. very quickly. One of the keys that proved effective for a proper police response was that the U.S. Coast Guard intercepted a Greenpeace ship full of chains, hooks, locks, and pipes. So Greenpeace is a political organization. As the name indicates, they try to portray themselves as being for nature and being for peace, but they often side with left-wing protesters. In this case, the Greenpeace ship was full of chains, hooks, locks, and pipes. These are weapons, these are instruments of disruption to be used by the protesters. How did the Coast Guard know that this ship was going to be involved? Well, police intelligence. Police had people embedded in some of these protest organizations and knew what was happening. And so here you have a ship full of equipment for protesters to use, intercepted before it can even make land in Miami. And that cut off a lot of the instruments of mayhem that the protesters were planning on using. In the 2003 protesters, there was 234 arrests of protesters and almost no property damage. That's a lot different than the $100 million of property damage in Miami in 1980. So here, a completely different police response, more educated, better equipped, more assertive, better intelligence, and this was night and day difference between the 1980 Miami-Dade police response and the 2003 Miami-Dade police response. This then, in police circles, was called the Miami model, and it emerged as a new proactive way to handle violent protesters. And so just as police departments around the country had studied the 1980 Miami McDuffie riots as a failure and studied it so they knew what mistakes not to make, now, 23 years later, police departments around the country were studying the 2003 protests in Miami as the Miami model, something that was proactive, something that worked, something that resulted in very little damage to property and very few injuries. And so it was studied as a positive thing, something to follow. So the Miami-Dade Police Department definitely changed the way it was seen by other police departments around the country. The anarchists had their own papers, and because the police had intelligence, in other words, they had people probably embedded within the anarchists, they were able to recover some of the papers printed by the anarchists. After the conference, the anarchists realized they lost really bad. In 1999, they were so happy because they were able to walk over the Seattle Police Department. So, trying again in 2003, they thought this ought to be easy. They tried to use the same tactics 4 years later in Miami, and it didn't work. So the anarchists were left to complain. Police harassment, they said. We were effectively curtailed by the well-organized violent tactics of the police. So even the anarchists understand the police were well-organized this time. They saw and they knew our tactics, they saw what was coming, and they effectively dealt with it. So what has happened? The police, doing a SWOT analysis, knew their own strengths and weaknesses and their opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Why did the anarchists fail? Because they didn't do enough research to know the strengths of the Miami-Dade Police Department. They assumed that the Miami-Dade Police Department would have the same weaknesses that Seattle had in 1999. So, the SWOT analysis was not done effectively by the anarchists, and the police won big time. We found ourselves flanked and cut off from a means of escape. So, what did the Miami police do? The Miami police had looked at the 1999 Seattle riots and found out that it was the police who were flanked. So the Miami police knew that the anarchists understood flanking movements. That's a basic military move. And the police practiced flanking their opponents. And now the police used the same tactics the anarchists used in 1999 in Seattle, the police used successfully in Miami in 2003. We were unable to reverse the tide. Again, all these quotes are from the anarchists themselves trying to explain why they lost the war with the police. The police were just too well organized. We displayed a naive and mass failure. Naive means a lack of knowledge and intelligence, and a mass failure. So the anarchists say, we failed big time. The police walked all over us. They were unable to criminally destroy the defenses of the city of Miami. We failed to regain the effectiveness and sophistication we witnessed in Seattle. Anybody who's going to write this has got to be intelligent, because they're writing this, the anarchists, the bad guys, are writing this as an after-action report to try to figure out what they did right in Seattle and what they did wrong in Miami and how they can correct it. So even the bad guys are doing a SWOT analysis. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So if the good guys don't do that, they're going to be walked all over by the bad guys. The bad guys are very sophisticated, and the police have to be also to head them off. And that's the end of Chapter 5C. Once you have viewed and taken notes on 5C, I encourage you to finish Chapter 5 in the segment called Chapter 5D. Thanks, and have a great day.